Welcome back to the APSCC 2020 live webinar series. I'm Christopher Slaughter and I'm your host for today's session, which is the economic realities of C-band in Asia Pacific and globally. Joining us today, we have the Senior Manager for Spectrum Policy at Intelsat, Mohammed Jawad, joining us from the UK. Mohammed, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris. It's nice to be here and I look forward to the presentation.
Oh. Since you're giving the presentation, we're looking forward to it as well. When I say we, I mean also Greg Daffner, who is the president of APSCC, as well as the CEO of GapSat. He's also joining us for the discussion after Mohammed's presentation today. So Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure for us to have Intelsat as a sponsor for this. Intelsat also providing the presentation and the thought leadership behind this, but also very generously supporting APSCC in our 2020 live webinar series. Very happy to have their participation today. We're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation now. Mohammed, just take it away. After that, we'll come back with more Q&A between yourselves and Greg and a short discussion after that. So please, when you're ready.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe. And I'm honored to be here. It's always a pleasure to present and talk about C-band and the reality of C-band in this region, particularly in Asia. So I have a few slides that I want to go through. The agenda for my presentation will cross over sort of at the background about C-band, talk about the outcome from WRC-19, touch on it globally on the status of C-band, what's going on around the world, and then focus a little bit on Asia. Then I'll like to talk about the economic realities, the balance between harmonized spectrum and licensed spectrum, and what is the need of justifying more spectrum for 5G. And then the technical considerations, talk about the way to mitigate protecting FSS services vis-a-vis new incomers such as 5G services in this frequency band. And then to wrap up at the end of the slides. So with that said, we'll get started. Just generally from the WRC-19, the outcome was that there was a number of agenda items that talked about C-band. However, when it comes to Asia, there was no future agenda item that specifically focused on C-band. So in that sense, for this region, it's good news. It shows that the value of satellite services and the inherent propagation characteristics of C-band in this region are vital for regulators. And I think that's transpired in the fact that there hasn't been an agenda item post WRC-19 for this region. With that said, there are other agenda items that touch on in other regions. For region 1, for example, there is agenda item 1.3 that is not so much looking at IMT technology, but to study the possibility of elevating mobile from 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz to primary. Currently, it is a secondary status. But like I said, this is not studying IMT per se. And then in region 2, there is agenda item 1.2, and that's actually looking at IMT technology and then trying to identify that in the 3.6 to 3.8 gigahertz, but also in the uplink frequencies as well. There is some touch on the uplink frequencies in region 3 as well, but that's not an FSS use band, so it's not of interest for this presentation. So these are the trends from the outcome from the WRC-19 that we have noticed. And like I said, in this region, there hasn't been any dedication to C-band. With that said, sometimes it's better to give you a graphical representation. And this is a graph to show you what the pattern looks like globally. I've also highlighted a number of key examples from some regions and countries. But if you look at the first 3 lines, the first 3 regions, region 1, 2, and 3, you can see that there is a common harmonization approach whereby from 3.4 to 3.6 gigahertz, anything that's colored in orange there, it seems that this is where the common harmonization or the consensus where 5G harmonized spectrum would lie or would be studied. And anything above that, there is defragmentation. It's difficult to achieve harmonization there. And there are a number of reasons on that, and we'll touch on some of them for this region in the follow-up slides. And I've mentioned the United States here. As viewers are familiar, Intelsat has been involved in the C-band process in the United States there. The conditions in the United States are somewhat unique in the fact that you are able to register all the teleports that the FSS use in that band. There has been a different political dynamics in that region. So there are a number of factors that has transpired into a market-led approach, and eventually there was an auction to take place in that region. But the conditions are different than they are in other parts of the world. That's the most important factor here. With that said, the mitigation techniques, and we'll touch on them on the follow-up slides, were factored into the FCC process. And this is something that is of great interest to the satellite industry, but also the satellite consumers and the customers of the bandwidth that the satellite provides. If we move into the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the dynamics and the ramifications of how the satellite is used to determine the policy of the identification of the technology. In other words, if you look at the United States again, the majority of the delivery of the satellite applications are B2B. So this is business to business, whereby you have a larger antennas predominantly registered and licensed. And the ability to mitigate and protect them is facilitated much more than it is for, if you look at in region 3, where it's a mixture of business to business, but also business to consumer, so B2C. And that's where the dynamics become more complex. And it's very hard for policy to address this head on to provide the right mitigation techniques, because B2C type of applications are normally unlicensed. So they are receive-only terminals for TVROs, for example. And when you don't have a database of registered terminals, it's very difficult to mitigate and to try and develop an environment to protect them. And this pattern is replicated in Europe, where the predominant applications for the satellite is also B2B. And as we saw in the previous slide, Europe also harmonized the traditional FSS to 5G services, because they were able to mitigate and protect vital teleports, such as, for example, Footnotes, the Intelsat teleport in Germany, has been warranted protection. Other parts, Latin America, again, it's a mixed bag between B2B, B2C, and also in Africa. And you can see that this pattern reflects the outcome from WRC, but also from the policymakers in these regions, that they have not yet determined where to allocate 5G. But the pattern seems to be that 3.4 to 3.6 is where the common harmonization is possible. Anything above that, it becomes very tricky for regulators to harmonize the spectrum. And there are exceptions to the rules. Obviously, there is some countries in region 3, for example, Japan, who have decided to go all the way to 4.1 gigahertz, provided that there are mitigations to protect teleports in that country. So some of the customers that have a licensed teleport in Japan, for example, we understand that the regulatory policy will protect these teleports if they are licensed. So the message here is that one size does not fit all. There are different dynamics in each region. And just because one region has decided to go down one route does not mean that that route is applicable for your region. And we can see that in region 1 more evidently than other regions, because you have Europe, Middle East, and Africa in that region. And so far, Europe has gone one way, but the other regions have not yet determined how to harmonize spectrum in the right way to balance it between different technologies. Now, when we look at region 3 in particular, post WRC 19, there were a number of countries that added themselves to an existing footnotes. And these footnotes are here on the table, and the 3 tables you can see on the screen. Anything in bold, these are countries that have added their names to the footnote after WRC 19. These frequencies are, and some of them are in the extended C-band, so from 3.4 to 3.6. You have countries which, are major countries that utilize satellite services. And you also have 3.3 to 3.4, which is not an FSS band, but that's an interesting frequency. So you have 100 megahertz there that could potentially be utilized for 5G technology as well. So that's an interesting route that Region 3 has taken, rather than to have an agenda item dedicated to studying a new C-band spectrum. They've looked at the existing spectrum that's already been harmonized for IMT vis-a-vis 3.4 to 3.6, and some of them have taken a decision to add their names to a footnote in these frequencies. In terms of our policy as Intelsat, what we're doing is try to, if you like, put them in a traffic light code, look at where there is more protection warranted, where regulators have gone to consider IMT, and where IMT has been already factored in as part of their policy. So these are sort of the color coding that we've looked at, where FSS is lying safe at the moment. And there are some countries that are right now considering 5G and what are the mitigation techniques to be considered. What we try and do in this instance is to play a role in any public consultations that take place, but also to engage with the regulators directly. Some of the lessons that we've learned from the US process on how to mitigate and protect FSS services that might be applicable in different regions have been factored, and we've tried to channel this into the discussion as well with these regulators. And where regulators have already made that decision, obviously we are very interested and keen to ensure that our customer teleports are protected. So I mentioned Japan, for example, where there is an ongoing consultation on Australia right now as well, where we're ensuring that our customer teleports and our teleports are protected vis-a-vis a separation distance or a filter and a guard band combination. So looking at maybe some examples where some regulators or some administrations have made a decision, Singapore is one of them. What's interesting about Singapore is they've looked at the current allocation of IMT. So this is from 3.4 to 3.6. But they've also factored in some guard band into the equation. And this is important because a lot of regulators, when you consider adding filters, a filter cannot operate on its own. It needs to have a bandwidth to transition for its operation to take place. And that's the frequency separation, or in other words, the guard band, that has to be factored into the policy when you're auctioning the spectrum. And that's been taken into account by Singapore. There has been a lot of consultations with the regulatory authority in Singapore, and it's good to see that they've taken that decision to apply a 50 megahertz guard band between the IMT spectrum and FSS spectrum. Another example is Hong Kong, where they've also looked at the ability to deploy guard band. In this case, they've actually applied 100 megahertz guard band. You might ask, what's the rationale between having different regulatory authorities applying different measures of guard band? And it all depends on the dynamics of the topology of the landscape of the country, but also on the number of earth stations that are deployed in that country and the aperture size of the antennas. So there are a number of parameters that determine how much of a guard band is applicable. So it's not one size fits all, again, for this particular mitigation techniques. And we can see that there are other examples in other regulatory authorities where they're also considering a guard band as part of the mitigation techniques. We haven't mentioned all of them, but there are others in this region. All of this lies within the 3.4 to 3.6. Some have gone slightly above. I've mentioned Japan, Korea is another example. In terms of our advocacy and engagement and collaboration, these are measures in the spectrum strategy where I sit. We take very seriously to ensure that the regulatory certainty for not just Intelsat, but the customers of Intelsat is there to provide to them the reliance of using that band for the future. And we break this engagement into three, categories. When we talk about advocacy, we mean, influencing the regulatory authorities, but also taking part in the WRC cycle, as we're going through one right now, responding to public consultations, and making sure that the lessons and the experience that we have is channeled through the consultation processes to take into account how you protect FSS in the right way. And in direct engagement, such as, talking directly to regulators, but also, being part of this panel to advocate and talk about the value of C-band and how it brings, value to citizens. So regulators should not take one technology over another, but have a balanced approach. And with collaboration, this is again where actual measurements are taking place, and we do a lot of studies with some regulators to explain how the value of filters with a guard band ensures the protection of FSS services and to efficiently utilize the spectrum across that range. So another argument I want to talk about is the economic realities. We've been talking about 5G as a given, and I think nobody can deny that mobile demand is increasing. But with COVID now, most of us are working from home. I'm connected right now through a Wi-Fi connection. I believe even when we were out attending physical conferences, when we're roaming, we're not actually on our mobile network connection. We're all offloading traffic over a Wi-Fi connection. And with COVID, I think this is more prevalent now. You can see that more evidently. But even with that in mind, we've been told that regulators, mobile network operators require anywhere between 80 to 100 megahertz to satisfy the need and the demand for 5G. However, when we see the post-auction process, now that auctions have taken place, in reality, when you consider a typical country which has 3 to 4 national MNOs, if you were to make 200 to 300 megahertz available, that would give you between 60 to 100 megahertz to an MNO. But when you consider some of the auctions that have taken place, for example, in the United Kingdom, we're seeing that MNOs are actually not striving for 80 to 100 megahertz. In reality, they're actually taking less than that. So there was a survey done in the United Kingdom by the regulatory authority, Ofcom, in response to claim by some MNOs that they needed access to 80 megahertz contiguous spectrum. It showed, and I'm quoting here, that there was no evidence, this is after they've auctioned the spectrum, by the way, that there was no evidence that 5G could not be delivered with smaller, example, 40 megahertz of non-contiguous carriers in other frequency bands. And you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, from your view, the bottom line, the red bottom curvature, that's 40 megahertz, and that is providing up to 770 megabits per second to mobile throughput. And this is a conclusion that shows, you don't need to have this 80 to 100 contiguous spectrum that we've been told is absolutely necessary for the MNOs to deliver 5G services. Add that to the fact that a lot of the consumers today around the world, wherever you are, you're actually offloading on Wi-Fi connectivity. It, begs the question, is more spectrum really justified? Particularly when at the same time, this spectrum is coming from a service that's being utilized today, such as satellite technology. So these are just real world examples. Again, I mentioned the UK EE network launched 5G across 6 cities with just 40 megahertz of C-band spectrum. Vodafone, again, 50 megahertz of C-band spectrum. Telstra in Australia right now has 60 megahertz of spectrum for 5G services. And there are other examples in the United States and others in the slides. So this is not really seen, with the narrative that we've been told that you need to have this amount of spectrum. We're not seeing that in reality. And these are other examples that I mentioned some of them, but these are others around the world where you can see that Italy, for example, 200 megahertz for the whole nation for 5G services. And if you recall the first slide I mentioned about the common harmonized range, where the common denominator is between 3.4 to 3.6, with that range plus the 3.3 to 3.4, you can have 300 megahertz available to provide to the number of MNOs you have in your own country. And that would be sufficient to provide 5G services based on some of the evidence that we're seeing from the auctions around the world. Another important factor that regulators should be mindful of is the fact that you risk oversupply in the market of spectrum. And this risk, when you're saturating the demand for an MNO for additional spectrum, leads to non-competitive auctions and lower auction revenues. And there are some examples that we can provide offline from Europe, for example, where a lot of the auctions have been taking place in C-band. That risk, the valuable spectrum which goes unsold or underutilized, while at the same time, this comes at the cost of negating the value of current technologies such as satellite services, which is providing valuable services to consumers, particularly in this region in Asia. So this oversupply and demand is a very critical point that regulators have to take into account when considering the amount of spectrum they would auction for 5G services. An interesting study that was done by LS Telecom in a number of regions, but in particular, they've looked at region 3 as well, which showed that today, and these are all the countries in region 3, you can see that, I'm not sure if you can see the yellow line, horizontal line, that's the amount of harmonized spectrum that is today available for mobile services. You can actually license that. On the right-hand side, countries like New Zealand, Australia, Philippines, China, Japan, and Korea, they've made most use of that. And you can see the red pie chart is, anything from now until from 2019. But the rest of the countries on the left-hand side of that pie chart still have some way to go to actually license that harmonized spectrum. That harmonized spectrum is not being licensed yet. So this begs the question, if you have so much available spectrum that is yet to be licensed, why is there a need to actually go for more spectrum? And I think regulators in region 3 are aware of this, too well aware of this, in fact. And this is why I believe there was no future agenda item in region 3 to look at C-band spectrum, because right now there is a lot of spectrum available for regulators to license. And this table here just shows you the figures about the availability of the spectrum. In total, 950 megahertz across different ranges of frequencies are available to be licensed by mobile network operators if they want to. This is already harmonized for mobile. And there are other alternatives as well. I mentioned a little bit about the 3.3 to 3.4 gigahertz, but there is the availability to refarm 2G and 3G spectrum. China is making a lot of studies on this, where they're looking at decommissioning some of the 2G, 3G networks and try to see if there is a value to refarm that spectrum for additional 5G. And in fact, if you look at the balance between capacity and coverage, where 2G and 3G spectrum lies, it's in that sweet spot to provide the capacity, but also the coverage requirement. Sharing spectrum among MNOs. Satellite do a good job today of sharing spectrum based on space coordination, and we've been efficiently using that spectrum for decades now between us, based on a lot of coordination between operators. But MNOs are not today, as far as I'm aware, sharing any of the spectrum that is being given to them. You can argue that there might be some complexity to that, but I think with new base stations and 5G, with the MIMO technology antennas, you require new base stations rather than using the 3G or 4G base station. So why not share infrastructure if spectrum is not possible to share? And I believe it can be, but infrastructure is certainly a possibility. And this is from a regulatory point of view, policymakers should take account of the fact if you are mandating regulated MNOs to share the same base station, you're bringing the capex cost down, but also bridging the digital divide between the rural and urban areas. Some examples like today, the United Kingdom has put obligations in their licensing conditions for MNOs to share the infrastructure. So that's one alternative for MNOs. And now with post-WRC 19, another alternative is the millimeter waves. So the 26 gigahertz is already being harmonized for potential 5G technology. There are other frequencies in the Q and V band as well. And these are designed to meet the capacity demand, if you like, in urban dense areas. So there are other alternatives to just C-band for MNOs to consider. In terms of technical considerations, we talked about how we're involved with regulatory authorities directly or through consultations. We are trying to ensure that if a policy has been given by a certain country to roll out 5G services whilst overlapping with existing FSS operations in the extended C-band, for example, that we engage with these regulatory authorities to ensure that FSS and mobile co-frequency sharing in the same geographical area, there are mitigations to ensure if it's not, I wouldn't say sharing, but to coexist in a way that is applicable. But we certainly know based on previous studies and from the WRC, ITU studies, for example, that sharing in the same band is not possible unless you have a frequency separation distance. And these are statements that were backed up by the vendors, the manufacturing industry from the mobile side as well. And what we mean by the impact and why this is not possible is that satellite earth stations are very sensitive to interference. If you consider a signal that's coming in from space 36,000 kilometers away, when it reaches the terminal, by the time it reaches that terminal, it's very, very weak and very sensitive. Compare that to a base station nearby with much higher power than the signal that's coming in. The LNBs on the terminals on the satellite, on the earth station is saturated because of the base station power. So 5G signals can interfere with the FSS receivers in two key areas: the saturation of the LNB of the earth station when the 5G base station is nearby, and that's why you need to have a frequency separation. But also out-of-band emissions of the 5G signal can cause in-band interference to the FSS signal. In other words, policymakers, when they're considering the 5G mask, we should not quickly turn into the 3GPP standards, because that standard has been devised based on theoretical studies and measurements. We should always try and see what is the reality and how we can deploy the right mask in order not to impact on adjacent services or in FSS services in band. And managing the interference from 5G to FSS, I mentioned the example of separation distance, but in cases where a separation distance is not possible, like Hong Kong or in Singapore, because of the geographical conditions in that area, then earth stations need to be fitted with a bandpass filter. And the filter goes in conjunction with a guard band. So you have to impose a guard band between the FSS and the 5G signals, or a frequency separation. And lastly, adopt an out-of-band emission limits on the 5G base stations so that they do not oversaturate the in-band in the FSS signal. So these are some of the mitigation techniques without going into too much detail, and we're channeling a lot of that information to the policymakers across the region. I've put a slide here in some of the filter technologies. AsiaSat has been doing a good job in promoting their own filters, and I think that's a commendable way. We in Intelsat are also doing the same, working with our customers to try and ensure that the right technology is applied, because there are different filters in the market and each filter operates in a different way. It requires a different frequency separation. And what we're trying to find is what is the most cost-effective, but also the most efficient way of maximizing the use of the spectrum, because I think regulators always want to make sure the efficient use of the spectrum. In other words, you want to make sure that the filter is placed at the right place with the right frequency separation needed for it to operate. This is more of a graphical representation of the summarization of what I've mentioned about the measures to protect the FSS. On one hand, you have the LNB, which we need to protect with the filter, but the filter has to have a guard band. And in some cases, you need to register the earth stations. So we encourage customers, if their earth stations are not registered, if they have a teleport earth stations, that they should be registered. And lastly, from the MNO side, out-of-band emission limits have to be imposed. So regulatory authorities, when they're licensing spectrum to the MNOs, should put these as conditions to ensure that the right 5G mask is in place, not to impact on the FSS signal. This is just, summarizing all the areas that we've mentioned in the previous slides on the need to protect the incumbent FSS operations. We're looking at an I/N target value to protect these teleports. In the 3.4 to 3.6, maximum mobile PFD limits as measured from the earth station should not exceed a certain value. And the protection of TT&C teleports is vital. And I think regulators recognize this. And that's why a lot of the regulators around the world, I mentioned Germany, for example, in our Footnotes teleport, they've taken a key decision to ensure that there is a wide enough geographical separation between a newcomer, such as a 5G base station, should not impact the teleport. And I'm just conscious of the time. I just want to wrap up with my final thoughts. In Region 3, I think the key takeaway is that core Asian countries still support FSS satellite in the 3.6 to 4.2, so in the conventional C-band. Some countries, however, have auctioned 3.4 to 3.7, but ensured the protection of FSS. I mentioned some of these countries in my slides, but others like Taiwan and Australia. Australia is going through a consultation process right now. There are exceptions, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, which have auctioned above 3.7. We're aware of these countries, we're not aware of others. Above 3.7 for 5G with limited mitigation measures to protect the FSS, for example, grandfathering existing licensed teleports. We expect mobile industry to continue lobbying. We're not under any illusion that this is not going to be forsaken, but we have good arguments. I've mentioned some of them that we will carry forward for this cycle as for the need or the justification for more spectrum. I think we have good arguments that there is no justification for more spectrum. And some of our action in terms of what we're doing is, making sure that we channel that narrative in the right way. Final thoughts from me, the reality of current and future use of C-band must guide regulators' decision in the right way. FSS C-band services are critical. There is a key attributes that we bring in terms of reach, economics, and resilience, bridging the digital divide, ensuring that citizens are able to see sport channels through their TVs, and the ability to provide critical services for civil aviation, and also cellular backhauling to the MNOs. It's all done by a satellite. There's no other means to do that across the whole country, such as Australia, for example, in an efficient way. And last thought for me is there are alternatives to regulators to consider other than just C-band. I mentioned refarming, looking at 2.3, 2.6 gigahertz that provides the capacity and the coverage. But also, if a regulator has decided to look at 3.4 to 3.6, or even up to 3.7, then technical considerations need to be in place to ensure that the right mitigation measures are there to protect the FSS. And we're here to engage with these regulators in order to achieve that goal for the best interest of our customers. So with that said, thank you for listening. I hope it's been valuable to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Mohanad, thank you very much. A very, very comprehensive program, very, very thorough, and looked at a lot of things. I think that one of the key takeaways, certainly from the early part, is that no two regions are the same. No two markets within a given region are the same. No two regimes are going to be the same. And I think that that's an important takeaway. I want to bring Greg into the discussion now. You know, as someone who's sat through quite a few rounds of the WRC discussions and negotiations over the year and been very active in C-band protection. Greg, you know, we've had this discussion or discussions like this a number of different times on a number of different fora, talking about WRC 15, talking about WRC 19. In terms of the outcomes from this most recent round, I mean, is everything that Mohanad laid out, does that pretty much feel like the end game, or not the end game, but the result that has been expected from all of this ongoing negotiation?
Yeah, well, thank you, Mohammed. That was fantastic, and thank you, Christopher. Let me give you a sort of the 50,000-foot view. First of all, I would describe the process that we have together lived through for all these years as death by 1,000 cuts. It's an endless process, an endless war. Started in 2007 at the WRC. Actually, it started several years before that, leading up to the 2007 WRC. And in those days, for those of you that can vaguely remember, the big fight was between the satellite industry and the reallocation of C-band, specifically C-band and some S-band spectrum, to something called WiMAX. WiMAX was supposed to be a really big thing back in the turn of the century, and it was originally proposed as primarily a fixed multi-point wireless broadband infrastructure. It was going to replace DSL. Can you believe it? How would that ever disappear? And cable modems. And then it was going to do a little bit of mobile broadband. Anyway, we, at the 2007 WRC, we largely beat the WiMAX proponents. We ended up with some footnotes where some countries said that they reserved the rights and blah, blah, blah. But across the board, we basically came away much better than we expected. And then we took up the fight really from there with the IMT cellular industry. And we had WRC 2007, 2012, 2015, and most recently, as you mentioned, 2019. Now, no one doubts the importance of cellular broadband. I mean, even those of us that work in the satellite industry, we're all attached to our mobile phones. And who wouldn't want to have capacity which was faster broadband at lower prices, right? But the real question that we've always faced is whether to get better, faster, cheaper mobile telephone service, do we need to give up any of our spectrum, and in particular, our C-band spectrum? So just to spend a second here taking a focus on the perceived requirements of 5G and their advocates for more spectrum. Before the WRC 19, the total amount of spectrum, and Mohanad pointed it out in a really good chart, showing what the allocations and what has been assigned licensed countries ranging from New Zealand across the entire Asia Pacific region. But fundamentally, there was total spectrum between 900 and 1200 megahertz that had been allocated for use and ultimately for licensing for various cellular services. At the 2015 World Radio Conference, the cellular industry claimed that they needed, and I don't know where they came up with these numbers, but the numbers were 1,340 to 1,960 megahertz of additional spectrum to be allocated to meet growing consumer demand by 2020, okay? So what happened at WRC 19? 5G was allocated 17,000 megahertz of additional new spectrum. That's right, 17,000 megahertz across multiple bands. And if you do the calculations, that's like 15 times as much spectrum as they'd gotten in the previous 20 some odd years. So actually more, 30 years. So the reality is that at WRC 23, they're looking for even more spectrum. Now, the cruel irony, as was pointed out in slide 17, is that roughly 50% of that spectrum, the pre-WRC 19 spectrum, has 50% has not either been allocated, or if it's been allocated, it hasn't actually been brought into use. So, I mean, we're talking about this much spectrum being used, this much has been allocated, and there is no end to the cellular industry's spectrum appetite. Okay, getting back to C-band. C-band is particularly useful for cellular operators because it provides them with a low-cost way of providing low-density, wide area networks that is spread out over suburban and rural communities, where a frequency band like C-band covers large geographic areas with a relatively small number of cell sites. And they can be built and operated at a much lower cost to the small cell millimeter wave spectrum, this 17,000 megahertz of it that was allocated last year. So in other words, the reason why the cellular industry wants our C-band is because it gives them a cheap and easy way to roll out 5G services that are really, when you take a look at that, it's just enhanced 4G infrastructure. So one thing that we got to bear in mind is that they've already got a bunch of our spectrum, and based on a number of studies that have been discussed at great length, and I think correctly, there's more than enough of it to support multiple operators in any given country to be able to roll out broadband services using a few hundred megahertz of the extended C-band. But in addition, there are alternatives, in particular, the refarming of the bands below 2 gigahertz that were originally licensed and are still used in a minimal way for 2G and for 3G services. The good news from a cellular operator's perspective, not from necessarily the equipment manufacturer's perspective who want to sell more kit, but from an operator's perspective, the lower frequency bands are far better than C-band because you get bigger coverage with the same amount of input, power and otherwise. And the lower frequency bands are capable of penetrating buildings, which C-band is not capable of doing. So when you walk inside, you can still use it. So the good news is, and I'll finish on this, we have fought this fight relatively successfully for the last 15 years. And I would say, while there's no doubt that we are going to need to continue to fight this fight for many years to come, if we work together and if we continue to have the support of our billions of users we can minimize the damage going forward to our industry.
Thank you very much. A concise answer but a long windup that actually gives us a lot of historical context. I think that's very useful. I think that there's a difference going forward, a little bit of a difference going forward between, particularly when you go back to the WiMAX example. What the industry is facing now is not WiMAX, it's 5G. A very different use case, a very different, I mean, yes, similar in the sort of contours of the discussion, but fundamentally different practice. And by 2023, it's not going to be speculative anymore, which it sort of still is now. Limited rollout of 5G networks in various markets have not been have not blown the world, the doors off the whole discussion. I mean, Mohammed, how do you see that as changing the discussion? In 2023, there's a lot more that's going to be rolled out. There's going to be a lot of stuff out there, real world examples of 5G networks that will, one presumes, help boost the discussion and add more momentum to the IMT industry's desire.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Greg, for, I think you've touched on a very important matters here. I think no one is denying the role of 5G. We certainly promote it. In fact, we as an industry are playing a role in being part of 5G, because 5G, let's not forget, is a holistic network. It's a network of networks. Is not just terrestrial technology. It's also now, if you look at release 17 3GPP, they're looking at the interface between non-terrestrial technologies such as satellite. And this is for applications such as connected cars, for example, where you possibly have an interface between a terrestrial and a non-terrestrial or satellite connectivity for firmware, software updates, areas where terrestrial technology cannot reach in Wi-Fi for airplanes, on ships, oil rigs, that kind of thing. This is where the satellite attributes play a role, and we are doing our bit in developing the standard in 3GPP so that satellite has a role in 5G. So no one is denying, despite what we've been saying, that 5G has a role and an important role to play and grow. However, what we're trying to say, and I think Greg touched upon that, is regulators have to ensure they play a right balancing act. And in so many ways, they are like the judge. We as a satellite industry are given our narrative, our case across. Naturally, the mobile industry will do the same. And this is where this death of 1,000 knives expression came. It's been an ongoing process. And in the middle is the regulatory authority that determines this. So the ITU, the WRC, is member driven by the policy decision makers, which is the countries and the regulators. I think they have to consider a number of factors. One of them is, how do you promote one technology whilst ensuring another technology is maintained, and because it's providing services that are valuable to your citizens? And how do you refarm other technologies to ensure that you provide the coverage attribute? And the last point is, the critical one, is the value of the spectrum. Let's not be under any delusion. Regulatory authorities are always trying to look at the auction process and how much revenue this brings into their coffers. So that is a very big incentive and a motivator for regulators to be driven by some of the narratives that the vendors, not the MNOs, from the mobile side have been driving for more spectrum, which will ultimately potentially reap a lot of revenue in the auction. But the message I hope I try to put across in the economic value part of my slide is that if you oversupply the market, you're not going to recoup the revenue that you're anticipating. Today, I think there was a study by the GSMA some time ago which highlighted that over $1 trillion has been invested in 4G technology. That has not yet been recouped in many parts of the world. And I think MNOs, I'm not talking about the vendors here, the MNOs who are ultimately going to pay for that spectrum, I think they're yet to recoup the value and the investment they made in 4G before they moved into 5G. When they do move to 5G, there has to be, from the regulatory authorities' point of view, I think, the right amount of spectrum available, not to oversupply the market, so that you can recoup the revenue that you're anticipating in the auction process. And we've been seeing that in the European auctions, where in Austria, for example, there is still a considerable amount of megahertz still yet unused after they've auctioned it. This should not be repeated, because you're not maximizing the efficient use of the spectrum. More crucially, you're actually undermining another technology which has been used for decades now: resiliency, reach, and the ability to bridge the digital divide, namely satellite technology. You're undermining that technology while you're oversupplying the market with spectrum that might not be utilized. So I think that's a very important matter for policymakers to consider.
And these are all very logical arguments. I want to drill into auctions and the precedents that the auction set in just a minute. But Greg, I mean, the arguments that Mohammed has just laid out are very logical and very sound and very rational. But do they actually do they matter that much against the emotional appeal of the IMT sector, which, you know, basically is just going to say it's better, it's faster, it's 5G, it's not 4G, it's 5G. I mean, that's a really simple kind of grassroots, lowest common denominator sort of appeal in some ways, that one trusts regulators are sufficiently wise to not fall for that kind of a simplistic argument. But then again, you know, can we necessarily trust in, you know, in their wisdom? I'll pass that one to you, Greg.
Well, you know, it's a tough call. I would say that, going back to one of the slides, which showed the regional differences between the B2B versus the B2C approach. First of all, one thing about cellular, 5G as much as 4G and 3G and 2G before it, is that regulators and all the rest of us are very directly familiar with this. We have it in our pocket all the time, as you pointed out. And the bottom line is that satellites are far more invisible. I mean, literally, they're thousands of miles away, regardless of what orbital plane they're in. And many people that are users and are heavily dependent on them are unaware that they're getting their communication via satellite. So we have an obligation, I think, to ourselves, our industry, and to persuade regulators, policymakers about the role that we have always played and we continue to play. Because out of sight, out of mind. That's first of all. Second of all, excuse me, our users are at best, more often than not, indirect users. So it comes through some company that is distributing information, whether it's doing backhaul for a cellular operator, or whether it's providing direct-to-home television services, or distribution to cable head ends, and so on and so forth. Making them aware of that we are a integral part of that process, of that infrastructure, and that entire service ecosystem. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is, it is a balance. It has to be a balance where there's a recognition, if we've done our job well and we have made our case loudly and continuously and persuasively, that we don't lose the capability of continuing to provide critical services. And the list of critical services, not just fund services, but stuff that, you know, matters of life and death, helped to make our case. And I will say that, and it's you know, unfortunate, but particularly here in Asia Pacific, we have catastrophes that occur with some regularity, where terrestrial infrastructure is wiped out in an instant, in a tsunami, etc. And the only way that it's restored is via satellite. So suddenly we have a very prominent and very visible role to play. And I think that we have to remind the decision makers that at the very least, we have to always be a plan B. And for many services, we are plan A.
Yeah. If I just come back to that as well, Chris, if I may, the notion that satellite is a delivery of niche sort of applications is also a misconception. Today, there are over 80 plus C-band payload satellites in Asia, providing over 3,800 TV channels. This is direct to consumers' homes across the entire region, generating revenues of 56 billion US dollars. This is a huge amount of market that is directly accessing people's homes and providing channeled content that people see every day. It's much like, the handset. You have a TV at home. Wonder how that transmission is being delivered. It's through satellite. So Greg is right that we need to keep promoting our role. I think the growth of eSIMs or in-motion terminals for whatever frequency bands that they're delivering is another type where satellite has a role to play, a predominant role to play. And we will continue to promote that where we go. But it's not just promoting the narratives, it's also doing the actual work. And I mentioned some of the work we're involved in 3GPP, other standardization bodies as well, where satellite operators are heavily involved in the next phase. What's the next application and what's the growth area where satellite will continue to play a role in. So that's a very important point that regulators need to take into account, and we hope we're doing that with them.
And just one thing. Fortunately, we don't have scurrilous rumors circulating about satellite services the way the cellular industry is facing, and 5G in particular, the rumors concerning towers and the spread of COVID and so on. Yeah. So some things are good.
That works to our advantage. I want to drill very quickly. We don't have a huge amount of time left. I mean, the promise is for about an hour, and we're getting very close to that. So with complete awareness that this is a subject that probably is an entire hour-long discussion in its own right, I want to get back to the idea of auctions. And obviously, we've seen some auctions taking place already, as you mentioned, and others that are getting underway. There is potentially a lot of money that governments can see as this being a way reallocating spectrum and putting it up for auction as a great way to get some money in the kitty. I mean, looking at the big one that's looming, obviously the U.S. is an example that it's not part of this discussion, but it does set precedents one would anticipate. Intelsat's U.S. experience, notwithstanding, to what extent do you see those auctions as actually adding more impetus to regulators or to governments to sort of go that direction, go that route?
So first of all, I think the conditions and the dynamics in the US are very unique to that market. The US, in so many ways, is a dominant market that could actually dictate its own policies because of the consumer, the large consumer base it has, and the ability to recognize that satellite is important. So whilst a lot of people are taking the notion that satellite is being thrown under the bus in so many ways in the US process, it's actually in the matter of fact it's not. They are looking at how to balance between what the demand is for 5G and how to cater for the satellite demand. And that's why part of the incentives is to actually launch additional satellites in the United States to mitigate some of the coverage capacity that is being removed from the auction process in the United States, whilst also recognizing guard bands should be in place and filters should be included to protect the FSS. So I just want to address that point, that it's a very unique case that that's applicable to that region. In other parts of the world, I mentioned that I think I'm very clear about this, that a lot of the incentives from the policymakers and the regulators is down the road about the auction and the revenue it might generate. But I think it's a very risky proposition if you're thinking the more spectrum you're going to put in the market, the more revenue you're going to generate. It doesn't work that way. And we're seeing that from some of the auctions that took place in Europe, where the bits per hertz were actually quite lower than other parts. If you were to look at the common amount of bandwidth that has been harmonized, I believe 3.4 to 3.6 is where the commonality lies, where you can maximize the most amount of revenue if you were to auction that spectrum.
And I would add that you're right, it's at least an hour's worth of conversation, but I'd say a couple of things. One, we actually in the satellite industry have addressed the auction of satellite spectrum and satellite slots a number of times in the past. The nature of our services are most efficiently conducted by providing coverage and applications for multiple countries. So when a single country says, we're going to auction this off and we're going to collect the money, it becomes a very major problem, and it just encourages a irrational kind of market situation, which we have fought against for many years. With regard to auctions of spectrum for cellular services, it's clear that it is a irresistible incentive for governments because the amount of money is ridiculously large, and almost everything else that a government can do to raise funds pales by comparison. So it's potentially very dangerous. I personally of the view that the biggest downside, and Mohammed has also touched on this, is that at the end of the day, if a company spends ridiculous, irrational sums of money to buy spectrum, that's the quantity of money they don't have to invest in building infrastructure, rolling out services, and providing discounted broadband services to the citizens of the country. So when I would counsel policymakers and regulators to be very clear when they balance this on of course, the value that the government gets to subsidize all kinds of other activities and mistakes on the one hand, on the other hand, the problems that they'll cause in delaying and potentially threatening the viability of service providers to be able to roll out in a timely and in a really effective fashion the services. So I think that's the issue that they've got to address. And I think all too often the decisions have been poorly made.
And of course, that's sort of a natural outcome. Look, gentlemen, we have just crossed the 1 hour threshold, so unfortunately we have to bring this to a close. And the good news is we have at least another 3 years to keep talking about it, because WRC 23 is just around the corner, a few corners around the corner. All that remains is thank you very much for your time. Mohammed Jawad, really appreciate your insights, and excellent presentation and very thought-provoking discussion. Greg Daffner from GAPSAT and APSCC, again, a pleasure to have you. And thank you very much to Intelsat for making the whole thing possible. Once again, and thank you in the audience for participating, for logging in. We hope you'll join us for the next in the series and the next several in the series. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.